Now, we're going to come as close tonight to doing, I think, something that everybody dreams of doing as we can possibly manufacture for, and that is step back in time and visit with at least one historical figure of our past whom I would guess most Americans, most of you, if you could say who you could see, this gentleman would be one of them. I'll let you see who I'm talking about now, see if you recognize him. And I think you get the idea that we're going to talk to a man who is making his career at the moment, not just pretending to be Abraham Lincoln. This is Richard Blake, who has become more of a scholar about Lincoln, and through his visage and his appearance and his study is being able to kind of, Richard, I think, tell us what kind of a person Lincoln was in reality and so forth. Welcome to Montage.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit now, why did you ever get started doing something like this?
Quite a few years ago, I got interested in doing one-man shows after seeing Holbrook do his Mark Twain and the Will Rogers. I thought that's quite interesting. I had the same height as Abraham Lincoln and facial features, so what better choice? And I spent a few years researching and trying to find out about his character and how he walked and how he talked, and put together a little one-man show and traveled the country, mostly to high schools, going around doing assembly programs. And
right.
The interest became so great that I got hooked on reading about Lincoln, and the more I read, the more I learned, and the more fascinated I was in that period of history. Until now, I'm traveling around for Lincoln National Life Insurance Company with a unique program, going around the country doing a question and answer type of program.
Right.
Or if we spend a day with President Lincoln in one of the schools that we go to, they're prepared as newspaper reporters, and they have a press conference with the president. And I suppose over the years, all of the knowledge I've managed to put together, I'm able to portray Abraham Lincoln up there and answer the questions as they ask.
Let me tell you what we're going to do now. We're going to now ask Mr. Blake to lapse into trying to be as much like Abraham Lincoln as he can with his background, and I'm going to now begin to talk to him as if I were with Abraham Lincoln, and his answers are going to be as close, I guess, as scholarship can get us today to the truth of Abraham Lincoln. And we're not going to ask him what he would do about Iran or anything else like that. That would be crazy. We're going to try and go back 100+ years and talk to and find out what Abraham Lincoln was like, as we have discovered so far now. Mr. Lincoln, I have read so much about you, and it's good to talk with you. I'm surprised. Everybody has always told me you had a great, deep voice and you were a great orator, and you really don't have such a deep voice.
No, I will leave that up to the little giant. Stephen Douglas has had the great oratorical voice. I myself figured that if I was going to speak to the people out there in the farm fields when I was debating, I'd better reach the feller in the back row, so I kind of shrilled up there a bit. I spoke up as high as I could.
Is it?
And I wanted to reach as many people as I could. I'm sorry I do not have that bass voice that so many people find that's so pleasing to their ears, but I just happen to be a backwoods boy that was raised up, and
yeah.
I can't change my ways.
Now, is all the things I've read about you true, that you really had to overcome tremendous hardship to get an education?
Well, it is a hardship when you do not have any schools. I moved to Indiana with my family in my 8th year.
Yeah.
And when we got out there on the frontier of Indiana, there just weren't any schools at all. And we had schools by littles. If some feller who could read or write happened to drift into the neighborhood, why, he was considered a wizard, and they'd open up a little school for us youngsters, and we'd all go down to what we'd call a blab school. But then school was usually out when he drifted away, which was sometimes maybe only a month later. I suppose they didn't stay around long because parents couldn't afford to pay him very much.
Of course, then, now, Mr. President, even it was considered almost unusual to even want to go to school, wasn't it? I mean, your father needed help in the fields.
That's right. That's one thing I did learn from my father when I was a youngster.
Yeah.
He taught me how to work, and he taught me how to work very hard. Of course, one thing he forgot to teach me was to love it. I never did like to work, and I suppose that's why I went into politics.
Now, I don't mean to be offensive to you now, but let me just try and find out some things. I've always kind of wondered if your adoption of your anti-slave position was not just a very shrewd political move to capitalize on the feelings of the country at that time and gain office. Or can you honestly tell me today that you really had this feeling that slavery should be abolished as a matter of deep principle to yourself?
A deep principle, yes. I've always been opposed to slavery. Could never remember when I wasn't opposed to it. Now, as a youngster, and I grew up in Indiana, my father was opposed to slavery. In fact, he changed from one church to another because the church he did belong to did recognize slavery, and he joined a church that was opposed to slavery. So I was brought up that way. When I was a youngster at 19 years of age, I went down to New Orleans and saw my first glimpse of slave markets, and it sickened me no end. And all my life I've been opposed to slavery. But I do believe there is a right way and a wrong way to do away with slavery. The abolitionists now believed in demonstrating and going out there and just taking away the slaves from those property owners. We must remember, it was constitutionally legal to have slaves in this country. I believe in obeying the law. I never believed in any of the riots that John Brown did, or I've never believed in any of the illegal methods of doing away with slavery. I believed in slow, gradual emancipation and compensated emancipation. Compensate those slave owners for their property. After all, they were sticking to the letter of the law.
But still, you wouldn't have had a black person in your cabinet in those days. I mean, I think we tend to see what you're saying to us in a different light 100 and some odd years later. There was still kind of an ingrained sense of discrimination in this country, which was apart from just pure slavery. In other words, what I'm trying to ask you is, did you still feel some sense of difference between you and a black man, even though you did not believe in slavery?
Yes, it was the feeling of the day, I suppose, that all people there was a class difference, but it was something that could be overcome.
Yeah.
Now, I face reality. When I see that there are white soldiers in the Army who would not want to fight alongside of black soldiers, I'm not going to disrupt the Army by putting black soldiers alongside of them. Now, that is disruption. And I must, as a politician, I must find the right way to do something. I am still the president of all the people, and I have to bend to the will of the majority and keep the majority happy. And still, my own personal belief is that all men should be free and should be equal and given equal opportunity. But I cannot fight a majority and expect miracles overnight. This must be done in a slow process.
Okay, now let's talk about a lot of things that I associate you with. I don't know where to start, and we can't do them all, but let's talk about the Gettysburg Address, which I had to memorize, and I'm sure most people watching had to memorize it. Is it true that you literally wrote that on the back of an envelope on a train ride somewhere?
No, that isn't true. I was asked to give a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of this national cemetery, and the principal speaker was Edward Everett, and he was, I know he won't get up out of his chair to speak for less than 2 hours, and he asked for a little time to write his speech, and so the dedication was postponed from October until November 19th, which gave me plenty of time to think about what I wanted to say. I don't think they expected me to even talk, but I did want to say something to the nation at that time. I put a lot of thought into what I wanted to say, and I spent some time in the White House several days before writing it on executive mansion paper. And on my way to Gettysburg, on the train, I thought about it. And the night before, I sat in the room and I changed the back end of that speech. But I did put a lot of thought and work in it. I did not write it on an envelope. It was written on executive mansion paper.
Now, okay, so you were there. He came first, as I've heard the accounts, and he did give a long-winded, great oratorical thing. And I guess you had the audience almost in collapse. They were ready to, they'd taken anything at that point. How did you feel at that moment? Did you know when you finished how long did your speech take?
Oh, I suppose it was less than 3 minutes.
Okay. Didn't have a PA system like we have today.
Well, I didn't need any. You see people at that time, they would mill around. They'd come in and listen to you for a while and go away for a while, and they'd come back and maybe go over and get a little bite to eat and come back. And that is mostly why most speakers spoke for 2 hours, because they repeated themselves quite a bit. I myself figured I'll catch them and say what I want to say, short and sweet, like the old woman's dance, before they walk away, and that's just what I did.
It seemed to me one of the great things that was accomplished in the Civil War by you was at the end of it that you declared hostilities ended, that the South, that the soldiers be returned, and that it just stopped right there and we try and go back to normal. Now, was that a hard decision for you to make? There were a lot of people at that time, as I've read, who wanted to punish the South for the war. I saw
no gain in retaliation or revenge. It does absolutely no good. I've always felt the best way to get rid of an enemy is to make a friend of him. You know, you can catch a lot more flies with a drop of honey than you can with a gallon of vinegar.
Right.
And to go down there and help these people and work together to build up this nation was the only answer. Now, to go down there with revenge and retaliation in our heart would only risk having a band of guerrillas running around the hills for years to come, and we did not want to risk that.
Now, I know you're not used to television and time, but we're running out of time. I've just got to ask you, you know, the times are tense, there's a lot of emotions running. Some people suggested you should be afraid for your life. What do you think? Are you afraid that someone might try to kill you, frankly, assassinate you? There have been other presidents killed while in office.
Before I even arrived in Washington, there was a threat to assassinate me in Baltimore. And, of course, Pinkerton was in charge of getting me there safely, and he suggested that I take an earlier train and go through Baltimore at nighttime on a different train, and which we did. The threat proved to be hollow, and but since that time, I've received 80 threats of assassination.
Really?
And I've taken it to a point where I don't think much about it anymore. It's become a common thing to receive threats of assassination, and I don't put much stock into it.
So you're not going to hide out in the White House?
No, Secretary of War Stanton keeps a pretty much on protection for me. He keeps a troop of cavalry going with me when we take a buggy ride, or there's always some soldier around, and he worries more than I do about it.
Any one last thing you want to say to people before you go to the theater this evening?
Well, I would say this, that we must always look into the past and see what our forefathers gave us. They gave us some blessings. They gave us freedom and liberty. And they gave them to us. We did nothing for that freedom and liberty. All we have to do is protect those liberties and freedoms, and protect them we must, and pass them on to the next generation. That's our only obligation.
Well, I hope we all listen to what you say. I hope you have a good time tonight, and we've enjoyed having you with us, Mr. Lincoln. I think you can see now that we're back into real life, what we've tried to present is how Abraham Lincoln would have responded had we had television and an interview. And of course, Richard Blake has been trying to give us answers based on the truth that we know now of Abraham Lincoln and so forth. And it's incredible to sit here and look at you. You look so much like him to think could very well have been that way, and you could have left this show and gone to the theater, and much like John Kennedy went to Dallas the next day, it all could have happened, and in fact it did. Any last thing you'd like to say to people about Lincoln?
Well, as I tried to put through in his thought, but I would like to put it through as from Richard Blake, we always worry about our problems of today. We always worry about what's in the future. We should always look to the past, look into history, and find out that all of these problems are not new. They've all happened before. Inflation has been around so many times, violence in the street, all of these things were worse in the past. We are really better off than we ever were. We should be more optimistic about things and quit complaining so much. And the more we look into the past, find out the reasons for our failures and successes in the past, then we can easier cope with the problems of today and the future.
Right. Those who do not know the past are condemned to repeat it, or a variation on that theme.
That's right.
Richard Blake, Abraham Lincoln, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
We've enjoyed it. We'll be right back.